When a young black boy boarded a plane alone, the flight attendant's instincts kicked in. Something didn't feel right. She questioned him, doubted his story, and even called for backup. But when the plane landed and she saw who was waiting, at the gate, her face went pale and the entire flight crew froze. What happened next stunned everyone on board. Stick around to find out the jaw-dropping truth, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss a story that'll leave you speechless. It was just another ordinary morning at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, the kind of place where the buzz of life never slows down. Travelers hustling to gates, announcements echoing overhead, the aroma of coffee and fast food lingering in the air, and the usual chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases and impatient footsteps. Business people in suits, families dragging tired kids, and tourists snapping last-minute selfies all moved with purpose through the sea of terminals. But amid this routine madness, one figure stood out, not because he was loud or drawing attention to himself, but because of how still and composed he was. A young black boy, probably no older than 10, stood quietly near gate C-29, holding a small navy blue backpack over his shoulder and a neatly folded boarding pass in one hand. His name was Elijah, though no one at the gate knew that yet. He wasn't glued to a phone or gaming device like most kids his age. Instead, he held a worn paperback book, its corners bent, its cover faded, clearly read many times over, and stood with the kind of patience that seemed well beyond his years. His jeans were clean and cuffed at the ankles, his sneakers white and spotless, and his collared shirt buttoned neatly under a light jacket. Every so often he offered a small, polite smile to passing travelers who happened to notice him, but most people were too busy rushing past to pay attention, except for one or two airport staff who glanced his way, their eyes narrowing slightly with silent questions. Why is that young boy traveling alone? Who's looking after him? But Elijah didn't seem worried. In fact, he looked like he'd done this before. When the gate agent began calling out priority boarding, Elijah stepped forward with calm confidence, handed over his ticket, and received a subtle double-take from the agent, who still let him through without comment. As he walked down the jet bridge, he didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because he trusted the plan. His mother had dropped him off that morning, making sure he had everything he needed. She had walked him through security, given him one last tight hug, and reminded him of the letter she'd placed in his bag just in case anyone had questions. She was a lawyer, detailed, prepared, always thinking 2 steps ahead, and she had made sure Elijah was good to go. As the boy found his window seat in row 14 and settled in with his book, a few other passengers looked over curiously. It's not every day you see a child flying solo without the unaccompanied minor lanyard or a guardian waving goodbye at the gate. But Elijah didn't seem lost or uncertain. He looked like he belonged. A flight attendant named Susan, experienced and sharply observant, noticed him as she walked the aisle doing pre-flight checks. She offered him a quick smile, but something about the sight tugged at her attention. She made a mental note to circle back and check on him once they were in the air. She'd seen kids travel alone before, but usually there was more protocol, someone escorting them, forms filled out, alerts on the flight manifest. Elijah had none of that. Yet here he was, calmly, flipping pages in his book while passengers filled in around him. It wasn't long before the plane finished boarding and began its taxi. From the outside, it was all routine, a flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles, nothing unusual. But for Susan, and soon for many others on board, this particular flight would turn into something no one could have expected. Because behind Elijah's quiet demeanor and independent spirit was a story no one knew yet. And as the hours passed and the miles between Atlanta and LA ticked away, one question began to grow in the minds of those who noticed the boy. Who is this kid, really? Why is he traveling alone? And more importantly, who's waiting for him on the other end? The answers to those questions were about to unfold in the most unexpected way, and soon, Elijah, without trying, without even realizing, would change the atmosphere of that entire airplane, revealing a truth that would leave even the most seasoned flight crew completely stunned. Shortly after the wheels lifted off the runway and the plane steadied above the clouds, the familiar hum of engines settled into the background, and the flight attendants began their routine checks. Among them was Susan, a seasoned crew member, in her mid-40s with years of experience navigating everything from nervous flyers to full-blown emergencies. She moved down the aisle with practiced ease, scanning seatbelts, offering napkins, and exchanging pleasantries with passengers. But as she approached row 14, her eyes landed on something that made her pause. A young black boy, sitting by the window, alone, reading quietly, his tray table down with a juice box and an untouched packet of cookies. Something about the scene gave her pause, not because the boy looked afraid or out of place, but because of how independent and composed he seemed. It didn't align with the usual behavior of kids flying without adults. "Hi, sweetie," she said, bending slightly and offering a warm smile. Her voice had the gentle tone she reserved for children, the one meant to reassure. "Are you traveling? With anyone today?" The boy looked up, his large brown eyes steady and respectful. "No, ma'am," he replied calmly. "I'm flying to Los Angeles to see my dad." His answer was smooth, well-spoken, and free of hesitation, which should have been reassuring. But for some reason it wasn't. "Did your mom bring you to the airport?" she asked, still smiling but watching closely. Elijah nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am. She walked me to the gate and helped me check in. She's a lawyer and had to go to work after." Susan nodded, offered another tight-lipped smile, and thanked him before walking away. On the surface, everything checked out. The boy wasn't nervous, he had a clear explanation, and he wasn't causing any trouble. But something continued to gnaw at her. She slipped back into the galley and flagged down her co-worker, a younger attendant named Rachel. "Hey," she said in a low voice. "Did you see the boy in 14A?" Rachel thought for a moment and then shrugged. "The one with the book? Yeah, why?" Susan leaned in slightly. "He's traveling alone. No unaccompanied minor wristband, no airline escort, nothing." Rachel didn't seem concerned. "Kids fly solo all the time now. Maybe he's just mature for his age." But Susan couldn't shake the feeling. In her years flying, she'd learned to trust her instincts, and something about this situation was raising too many questions. Was the paperwork in order? Did anyone double-check that he was supposed to be on this flight? Why didn't she see anyone drop him off at the gate? Maybe the mom had left quickly, but still, airline policy was usually strict with minors flying alone, especially when they were this young. Her mind started cycling through scenarios. What if the boy had gotten on the wrong flight by mistake? What if someone had sent him with the wrong documents? What if he wasn't supposed to be traveling alone at all? Her concern wasn't out of malice. It came from a place of protectiveness, but still, there was a subtle edge to it, one she wasn't fully aware of, a quiet bias lurking under good intentions. She'd seen missing children cases on the news before, and part of her wondered, what if this boy was running away, or worse, being trafficked? The thoughts spiraled. She walked back down the aisle a little while later under the pretense of checking snack preferences, but her eyes drifted back to Elijah. He was still reading, flipping pages with focus, legs crossed comfortably, utterly unbothered. But now he noticed her watching. He looked up, offered a small smile again, and then returned to his book. It wasn't defiance, it was simply composure, the kind that felt both impressive and unusual for a kid his age. Susan felt conflicted. Her training told her to be vigilant. Her heart told her she might be overstepping. But her gut kept pressing. Back in the galley, she picked up the intercom and discreetly asked the captain if there was any record on the flight manifest of an unaccompanied minor in 14A. A minute later, the response came back. No special flags, no alerts. Susan frowned. Maybe it was just a clerical error. Or maybe, she thought, something had been missed. The other flight attendants began to notice her unease. Rachel tried to reassure her. Look, the kid's clearly smart, clearly calm. He probably does this all the time. But Susan wasn't convinced. She didn't want to be wrong later. She didn't want to end the flight regretting that she hadn't said something if it turned out the boy needed help. And yet, every time she interacted with Elijah, he was respectful, polite, and fully in control of his situation. He never once gave her a reason to doubt him. Only her own imagination and uncertainty did that. Still, She began considering whether to involve airport security upon landing, just to verify. She even considered discreetly asking for the boy's father's name to cross-check it through the airline. But a quiet voice in the back of her mind began to whisper, "Is this really about the boy's safety? Or is this about your discomfort with a young black child appearing more independent than you expect?" She ignored the voice. She thought she was doing the right thing. After all, wasn't it better to be cautious? But in her caution, she didn't realize she was underestimating Elijah, projecting doubt onto him not because of anything he did, but because of who he was. And as the minutes ticked on and the flight continued its path westward, she had no idea that the answers to all her questions were waiting just beyond the runway in Los Angeles, where everything she thought she knew was about to be turned upside down. As the hours passed and the plane hummed steadily through the skies somewhere over Texas, the tension that had quietly been simmering in Susan's mind began to boil over. Her instincts, which she had always prided herself on, were ringing louder than ever, and she finally convinced herself that she couldn't just sit back and do nothing. So, once the cabin had quieted and most passengers were either napping, flipping through magazines, or watching in-flight movies, Susan made her way down the aisle with determined purpose and stopped once again at row 14. Elijah looked up from his book as she crouched beside his seat, her expression no longer just curious. It was serious, concerned, almost investigative. "Hey again, Elijah," she began, her tone gentler than her eyes. "I just want to make sure everything's okay. I'm not trying to bother you, but sometimes kids your age need a little help, even when they don't think they do. Do you have your dad's contact info with you? Maybe we should just check in with him, just to be safe." Elijah blinked, clearly confused, but not rattled. There was a long pause before he nodded slightly and reached into his backpack, unzipping a small front pouch where he carefully pulled out a neatly folded sheet of paper. Without a word, he handed it to her. Susan took the paper and unfolded it, revealing a professionally printed itinerary complete with flight numbers, addresses, and a section titled Emergency Contacts, where both parents' names and phone numbers were listed. Attached was a notarized letter, complete with official stamps, explaining that Elijah was traveling with parental consent and authorization to visit his father in Los Angeles. Everything was meticulous, almost too well prepared, and yet instead of easing her concerns, it only seemed to raise new ones in Susan's mind. She glanced down at the page, her eyes scanning the names again. His last name matched both parents. There was nothing out of order. Still, something about Elijah's calmness, the maturity with which he handled himself, the fact that he didn't act like a confused or frightened child, somehow made her feel even more suspicious. She tried to mask it with a smile, but her next question betrayed her doubt. "And what does your dad do, sweetie?" she asked, casually but carefully. Elijah looked up, unbothered, and replied with a slight smile. "He's in entertainment." That word, entertainment, hung in the air like smoke, vague, slippery, open to interpretation. Susan's eyebrows twitched. Entertainment could mean anything from musician to actor to YouTube personality, or worse, in her increasingly imaginative mind, something suspicious. She stood up, nodded politely, and said, "Thank you, Elijah," before walking briskly back to the front of the cabin. Her concern wasn't malicious. She truly believed she was doing her job, looking out for a child. But the line between caution and presumption had begun to blur. Inside the cockpit, she quietly spoke to the captain, her voice low and careful. "I need you to check with the airline," she said. "Ask if this boy, Elijah in 14A, was registered as an unaccompanied minor. I know he has paperwork, but something doesn't feel right." The captain, while a little skeptical, agreed to send the message to ground control for verification. Meanwhile, the murmurs in the cabin began to rise. Passengers sitting near Elijah had noticed the repeated visits, the concerned looks, the whispered conversations in the galley. One woman leaned toward her husband and muttered, "Why is she bothering that poor boy? He's just reading his book." Another man a few rows back whispered to his wife, "This is getting uncomfortable. He's clearly fine." The discomfort started spreading, not from Elijah, but from the actions being taken around him. Elijah, to his credit, stayed remarkably poised. But even he, young as he was, could feel the weight of the stairs. He shifted slightly in his seat, his body curling toward the window, his hands gripping his book just a little tighter. For the first time since boarding, he looked tired. Not physically, but emotionally. Tired of being doubted, of being questioned, of having to prove again and again that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had done everything right. His mother had done everything right. But somehow, that still wasn't enough. Susan paced near the galley, watching him from a distance, unaware of the conversation unfolding just a few feet behind her. Rachel, the younger attendant, whispered to another crew member, "Why is she pushing this so hard? The kid's paperwork is spotless." But Susan's mind had locked into a loop of what-ifs. What if something was wrong and no one did anything? What if she let this go and it turned out to be a mistake? She had been praised before for her vigilance. She had been the one to catch a stowaway passenger once, and that memory fueled her drive now. But this wasn't the same, and she didn't realize how much her suspicion was being shaped not by facts, but by assumptions. By now, even passengers not directly near Elijah had begun to pick up on the tension. A woman in first class mentioned it to a flight attendant when asking for a drink refill. "What's going on with that little boy in the back?" she asked. "He looked scared when I passed him on my way to the bathroom." And though Elijah wasn't actually scared, the scrutiny was starting to leave a mark. A soft crack had formed in the shell of his confidence, and he began wondering why, even after showing proof, the questions kept coming. He thought about his mom, her careful instructions, how she had said, "If anyone asks questions, just be polite. Tell the truth. You don't need to be afraid. You're doing nothing wrong." But now, even truth and politeness seemed not to be enough. He stared out the window, the clouds rolling past beneath the wing, and silently wished the flight would just land already so he could see his dad. That wish, that small, desperate hope, was what finally cracked something in Susan too. But not yet. For now, she was still too deep in her concern, too blinded by the possibility of danger to see that. The real issue was her inability to accept that a 10-year-old black boy could travel with such composure and be completely fine. And as the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, and the messages from the airline began to trickle back confirming that Elijah's ticket, itinerary, and documentation were all legitimate, Susan found herself at a crossroads, still unsure, still uneasy, but about to face a truth she hadn't seen coming. Because waiting at that arrival gate was someone who would make her rethink everything, someone whose very presence would flip her entire narrative upside down and show her just how wrong first impressions could be. As the aircraft gently tilted its nose downward and began its descent toward Los Angeles, the seatbelt sign chimed on, and the cabin grew quiet with the familiar hush of anticipation that came near the end of a long flight. The sun was setting over the California horizon, casting warm amber streaks across the clouds outside Elijah's window. While most passengers were adjusting their seats and gathering their belongings, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice, calm and friendly, broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly, and we've been informed that we have a very special guest waiting at the gate to greet one of our passengers." The announcement, though vague, sent a ripple of intrigue through the cabin. People exchanged glances, eyebrows raised, murmurs floating up like steam from coffee cups. Who could the guest be? A family reunion? A surprise? A celebrity, maybe? Elijah, who had remained composed the entire flight despite the scrutiny he endured, allowed himself the smallest smile, his fingers brushing the folded paper in his backpack. One last time for reassurance. Not that he needed it anymore. He knew what was coming. As the plane touched down with a soft bounce and taxied toward the gate, passengers started to stretch and stand, reaching for bags and jackets, chatting casually. But Susan wasn't focused on the landing or her post-flight checklist anymore. She had made a decision. She was going to walk Elijah off the plane herself. If anything, she reasoned, she was simply finishing what she started, making sure the child reached his destination safely. Perhaps she still held on to the faint hope that something would justify her earlier doubts. Or perhaps deep down, she wanted closure, A final confirmation that she hadn't misread the situation as badly as the pit in her stomach suggested she had. Elijah stood patiently by his seat, backpack slung over one shoulder, and followed her quietly toward the front of the plane as the passengers filed out. The jet bridge door opened, and as the two stepped forward into the terminal, the atmosphere shifted instantly. A wave of energy hit them. A crowd had gathered just beyond the security line, a soft buzz of excitement hanging in the air. And then the murmurs that had filled the cabin moments ago turned into audible gasps, whispers, and flashes of phone cameras. Susan's eyes darted ahead, confusion giving way to shock. Standing just outside the glass doors, flanked by a small team of airport security and assistants, was none other than Darius King, not a look-alike, not someone who resembled him. The Darius King, international movie star, award-winning actor, global philanthropist, the face that graced movie posters and magazine covers around the world, known not only for his talent, but for his fierce protection of his private life. And now, there he stood, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, sunglasses perched atop his head, his arms outstretched and his smile brighter than the flashbulbs going off around him. "There's my boy," he called out joyfully, his deep voice echoing above the din. Elijah's face lit up, his smile breaking wide as he sprinted toward his father, backpack bouncing behind him. Darius dropped to one knee and wrapped his son in a tight hug, holding him with the kind of love that doesn't require words. Cameras clicked. Bystanders gasped. Several airport staff members stood frozen, not from fear or confusion, but from sheer awe. It wasn't just a father meeting his son. It was a moment that shattered every assumption anyone had made. Susan stopped walking. Her feet felt suddenly heavy, like they were glued to the carpet. Her mouth opened slightly as the realization washed over her. She had just spent the entire flight questioning this child's story, inspecting his documents, calling in checks, and whispering doubts, all while his father was one of the most respected, beloved figures in the entire world. Her assumptions, built slowly and silently on little more than suspicion, had just crumbled in a single moment. And it wasn't just the fame that stunned her. It was the ease, the affection, the evident truth in Elijah's calmness all along. He hadn't needed protection. He hadn't needed suspicion. He needed belief. And Susan, in all her experience and training, had missed the mark completely. Darius looked up from hugging Elijah and locked eyes with her. His expression was unreadable. Not angry, not cold, but clear. There was a silent knowing in his gaze, a quiet confrontation that didn't need to be spoken aloud. He gave her a polite nod, his voice smooth but pointed. "Thanks for keeping an eye on him," he said simply. The words weren't dripping with sarcasm or coated with disdain. They were measured, professional, even kind. But Susan felt the sting of them like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, to explain, to apologize, but nothing came out. What could she say? That she was just doing her job? That she meant well? That she didn't recognize a child's confidence for what it was? She stood there, watching father and son walk away, surrounded now by fans and assistants, security, keeping a respectful distance. Elijah glanced back just once, not with anger, but with a look that said he understood more than she had given him credit for. And then he turned back toward his father, who placed a protective arm around his shoulders. As they disappeared into the crowd, the terminal slowly returned to normal, the buzz fading, and Susan finally turned to head back toward the plane, her thoughts tangled and heavy. She had spent a lifetime in the skies, encountering thousands of passengers, countless stories, and yet today, on what should have been just another routine flight, she had learned a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. She had been reminded that assumptions, even quiet ones, have power, that professionalism without empathy can become prejudice in disguise, that seeing someone's truth requires more than a checklist. It requires humility. And as the gate agents prepared for the next round of boarding, Susan stood alone for a moment longer, watching the sunset pour golden light through the terminal windows, wondering how a quiet boy with a book had managed to teach her more in one flight than she'd learned in years. As Elijah and his father disappeared into the warm California evening, surrounded by the distant flash of cameras and hushed excitement of onlookers, the world around them seemed to glow a little brighter. Not because of fame, not because of celebrity, but because of a simple reunion between a boy and his dad that carried far deeper meaning than anyone could see at first glance. For Susan, however, the moment did not pass so quickly. As she lingered near the gate, watching the final flashes of Darius King's silhouette fade into the crowd, she found herself rooted in place, not by awe or admiration, but by something heavier, an inner reckoning she hadn't expected when she woke up that morning. On the surface, she could have written the entire flight off as just another workday, another child flying solo, another celebrity making headlines. But her heart wouldn't let her off that easy. She had to confront the quiet but persistent truth echoing in her chest. She had misjudged Elijah, not because of anything he had done, but because of the narrative that had played out silently in her mind the moment she saw him sitting alone by that airplane window. Even with his gentle manner, polite answers, and clear documentation, something inside her kept questioning, kept doubting, kept asking, "Is this okay?" And now, faced with the undeniable warmth and reality of his reunion with his father, Susan was left to reflect on why she felt the need to ask that question in the first place. Back in the crew lounge after the flight, the buzz of the day still swirling among staff, Susan sat quietly with her coffee, staring into the cup like it held the answers she was searching for. The lounge was filled with typical post-flight chatter, delays, passenger quirks, crew rotations, but her mind was elsewhere. Finally, she looked up and addressed a few of her fellow attendants, her voice softer than usual but clear. "I think I jumped to conclusions today," she admitted. The others turned, curious. "That boy, Elijah, I kept pressing, checking, second-guessing, and I realized it wasn't because he did anything wrong. I think I just assumed." The room grew quiet, her words cutting through the air with quiet weight. No one interrupted. He was composed, respectful, had every paper in order. But I kept pushing. I thought I was doing my job, but maybe it was something else too. It was a moment not of shame, but of honesty. And in that honesty was growth. One of her colleagues nodded slowly and said, "We all have blind spots. What matters is that you see them." And that was the beginning of something bigger. Susan didn't just go home that night and forget the day. She read, she listened, she talked to friends, colleagues, people with different perspectives. She learned about implicit bias, about how even well-intentioned people can carry assumptions they're not fully aware of, and how those assumptions can make others feel unseen, untrusted, and misunderstood. Especially children of color who are simply trying to navigate a world that often watches them more closely than it should. The incident with Elijah stayed with her, not as a source of shame, but as a spark, a turning point. And Elijah. He likely had no idea just how profound an impact his quiet strength and poise had made on that flight. To him, it was a day of excitement, of reuniting with his dad, of flying solo like the big kid he was proud to be. But in his calm presence, he had unknowingly held up a mirror for those around him. He reminded everyone watching that grace under pressure is not a signal of guilt, that respect should be returned, and that no child should have to work twice as hard to be believed. He taught a plane full of strangers that dignity doesn't always come with age or authority. It can radiate from a young boy with a backpack and a good heart. His story wasn't just about a famous father waiting at a gate. It was about the power of looking past stereotypes and recognizing the humanity in every person, regardless of their age, skin color, or situation. It was about acknowledging the moments where we as adults need to step back and ask ourselves if we're truly being fair, or if we're letting silent biases do the talking. And in that moment, Susan wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a student, learning from a young teacher named Elijah, who didn't raise his voice or argue, but instead showed patience, confidence, and quiet strength that made the truth undeniable. That flight became more than a journey from Atlanta to Los Angeles. It became a wake-up call, a reminder that the most important thing we can offer someone is not suspicion, but belief. That we should strive to treat every child, especially those who are too often doubted, with the same warmth and trust we would want for our own. Because kindness should never come with conditions. Respect should not be earned based on how someone looks, but given freely because it is their right. And sometimes, the greatest lessons don't come from textbooks or training manuals, but from the smallest, most unexpected passengers on board. Elijah didn't ask to be a teacher that day. He just wanted to see his dad. But in doing so, he opened hearts, shifted minds, and reminded everyone watching that the world becomes better, not just when we protect children, but when we choose to believe in them from the start. Thanks for watching. Remember, true kindness means giving trust without doubt and seeing people for who they really are, beyond assumptions or appearances. Let Elijah's story inspire us all to choose empathy over suspicion and to treat everyone with the respect they deserve. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful, inspiring tales, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community. See you in the next video.